Shalom and welcome to another edition of the Daily Bread, where we discuss the weekly Parashat. This week's Parashat is a special Parashat. It's for the holy day Pesach or Passover, and it is a special reading instead of Kedoshim, which would have been this week. We will read the special Passover Parashat, and that is in Exodus 33:12 through 34:26, and Numbers 28:19 through 25. Also Ezekiel 36, verse 37 through 37, verse 14. So my message this year is called Set Apart for YHWH. And we'll start off this week's Parashat as we see a dialogue between Moshe and YHWH. And I'll read this first portion because I think it's relevant to set the tone for this week's Parashat. It says, And Moshe said unto YHWH, See, you say unto me, Bring up this people. And you have not let me know whom you will send with me. Yet you have said, I know you by name. And you have also found favor in my sight. Now therefore I pray you, if I have found favor in your sight, show me now your way, that I may know you, that I may find favor in your sight, and consider that this nation is your people. So we start off with this desire to draw near to YHWH. He wants to see his way. He wants to know him and to find favor in his sight. So you see this yearning by Moshe. And really this concept of being set apart for YHWH, what we're really going to discuss is what is this relationship between the desire to serve YHWH and then the actual mechanics or process of how we go about doing that. And I think that right now there's a lot of confusion in what that is. Many people have let the church, and really the church within the last 100 years, determine what it looks like, when you go beyond the desire to serve God and what that looks like and what you're supposed to do. There's all kinds of theologies about what that's supposed to look like, or whether it's supposed to be evangelizing the gospel and going and telling other people about God, or whether it's to live a righteous life, or, there's all these various ways that people see what they should do as far as after they decide to have this relationship with God. Well, what should we do about that? And how should we go about that? What should it look like? That's what we're going to look at, and I think it's really shown in this week's Parashat, this special Passover Parashat, what that may look like, and that it may look like a little different process than what people expect. So we start off with this desire to know YHWH, a desire to see his ways. And then we get into verse 14 where he says, And he said, My presence shall go with you, and I will give you rest. So we get this concept of this promise for the future. YHWH's response is that he will be with them and he is going to give them rest. And next in verse 15 through 16, we see that it says, And he said unto him, If your presence go not with us, carry us not up from here. For wherein shall it be known here that I and your people have found favor in your sight? Is it not that you go with us? So shall we be separated, I and your people, from all the people that are upon the face of the earth. So Moshe's response to this, he wants to draw closer to him, to know God, and God says that he will be with them and he's going to give them rest. And Moshe's response is that they don't want to move if it's not with God, because this is how they'll know that they've found favor in God's eyes, if that God dwells with them, if God's willing to dwell with them. And this is how all the other nations will see that these are his people, because he dwells with them. So this brings up to our first very important point, which is these are the signs that we've found favor, which so many times is translated as grace, if God dwells among his people. But it isn't the Christian style of grace that we've seen here, where it becomes this ambiguous thing. Oh, well, we're just under grace. We have the grace. But there's no signs of that grace. There's no fruit of that grace that's tangible that we can see. And so what we start to see in verse 15 and 16 is that this, when he asks in verse 13 that he may find favor in his sight or grace in his sight, there's proof that that's happening, and that is that God's dwelling among his people. And if he doesn't go with them, which is the alternative, they're calling themselves God's people, but God isn't willing to dwell with them, then they don't have the favor. It doesn't matter if you claim that you are joined to God, if you've chosen God, he still can either show favor to you, grace to you, or not. And this is something that isn't really taught nowadays. Grace is assumed. There's an assumed grace that if you just choose God, then you're under his grace. But the problem is here we have Moshe, who clearly has chosen God, and even God has chosen him. Out of a lot of people, he's definitely one of God's chosen people, and yet he says, that the sign of his favor with God is going to be that God will dwell with him and dwell with the people. So as we go further, we look at verse 15, 16. What this also says is that the people will walk with God. They're not just going to walk and it won't be with God, but they're going to walk with God, God being among them. And this is another concept that's a lot of times lost in the various religions, both Messianic and Christian, all these different things, is that what does it mean to have God walk with you and to walk with God, more importantly? You can't, as the scriptures say, can two walk together unless they be agreed? And so to walk with or to be yoked to God, like two animals in a yoke, they have to walk the same way. Otherwise it creates chaos. They won't go anywhere. And this yoke that comes upon us is the Torah. This is how God walks, the halakha. How God walks and acts is revealed in his Torah and his instruction. So if we are to walk with God, if we are to know that God is among us, it basically goes down later when it says not to do the ways of the other nations that he cast out. So if you walk after their ways, God won't walk with them because of the way that they walk. They've been cast out. And so this delineation is important because it really shows us that, number one, God will not walk with you if you're walking in wickedness. And at the same time, we have Moshe here, who was a righteous man, and even he's saying, he's not saying, oh, well, I've already accepted you into my heart, or I believe in you, or anything. None of that stuff mattered. And yet in modern religion, that seems to be the foundation piece. Well, if you just say you believe in Jesus, then, you're saved, then you're under grace, then you've got, God walking with you, and they've got all these nice things that sound really great, but the fact is they're not really backed up in the scriptures. The scriptures don't point to that kind of relationship. Just walking and just joining Israel or believing in God, whatever you want to call it, is only part of the process. Next thing we're going to look at is in verse 33:20. Moshe asked to see the glory of YHWH, and YHWH, so here's his desires, to see the glory of YHWH. Now YHWH's response to him, Moshe, who's righteous and chosen by God, and prophet, leader of Israel, he didn't just get what he wants. God replied to him and said, you cannot see my face, for there shall no man see me and live. So this is a very important pattern too, because what we see right off the bat is that here was a righteous man. Here was a man already clearly chosen by God. And yet, he couldn't just do whatever he wanted. He couldn't, nowadays in religion, You have people who just say they believe in God, and all of a sudden, whatever their heart's desires, that's what they think God's going to grant them. Well, however they interpret the scriptures, that must be how God's going to act towards them. Surely God's going to do this for me and do that for me. I can boldly go to the throne, because I can trust in His mercy, and all these things sound great. But the fact is what you have is you have people who were hand chosen by God. And when we read about their accounts in the scriptures, you realize that just because they said something or wanted something didn't mean that's what they got. So there was a disconnect between what Moshe asked for here and what God was willing to give him. And yet, people now, they think that that God will grant their every request and all that, and I just don't see that in the scriptures. So we have this concept that even God, with His chosen people, has a process that He brings people through, and they have to fall in line to His process. It isn't going to reshape itself for their desires and for what they want and their expectations. So when we look at Exodus 33:23, it says, he says, okay, He's not going to let him see His face, but here's what I'll do. I'm going to put you in the cleft of this rock. I'm going to cover you with my hand when I'm going to go by, and it says, and I will take my hand, away my hand, and you shall see my back parts, but my face shall not be seen. So he just isn't going to get to see YHWH's face, whether he wants to or not. And this is Moshe. But he will be allowed to see his backward parts. So this is this concept of less than you desire. Yet how many people in religion now believe that they're going to get anything less than they desire? People just don't. They think they're going to get exactly what they desire. And the fact is, I think many of them are going to be shocked when they realize that Mashiach isn't going to be exactly how they thought. The kingdom isn't going to be exactly how they thought. They base a lot of their desires not off the scriptures and what's happened before, but by just playing their own imagination and desires of their heart. And what we see here is even the righteous and holy chosen of Elohim are going to many times get less than what they desire. And this goes into a concept of self-control, which is very important. Self-control means just because you could take something doesn't mean that you should have it. Just because as an adult I could go eat, chocolate till it's coming out of my ears. I could have as much as I desire. As a kid, we all want candy and chocolates and all this. As an adult, hey, nobody's going to tell you can't have that. But the fact is you have to have some self-control. Self-control is about saying, I could go have more, but I choose not to. I choose to moderate myself. And we'll see that that's in very close alignment to interacting with God and interacting with Elohim. And that you can't just seek after your own desires. Because as we see with Israel, all through the wilderness, they had their own desires, and they lacked self-control in many instances, and this ended up being something negative and a punishment for them, where they needed to have control. So next is in 34:3, it says, he tells Moshe to come up to him in the mount. He says, and no man shall come up with you, neither let any man be seen throughout all the mount, neither let flocks nor herds feed before the mount. So here we see another example where Moshe is told to do something, but it comes with a process. It comes with restrictions. It isn't just anything goes. Everybody who wants to see YHWH can just come to him. It's far from that. As a matter of fact, the penalties if people would come before YHWH that weren't supposed to is generally the death penalty. And that even includes animals. So, this concept, this modern concept that we have, that we can just say we believe in God, and then we can just approach Him in any way we want, at any time we want. I've heard people say that they're going to, boldly go to the throne, and they're going to go into the Holy of Holies and all this. And they don't realize that even the high priest, in fear and trembling, would only go in there and was commanded by God through Moshe not to just come in there at any time. And that was the high priest chosen by God among all of Israel. So people have to just get this notion out of their head that they have this free access to God. It just never worked that way. Whenever God dwelt with His people, even His hand-chosen people never had free access to Him. And there was always a process that we went through. So next, what we see here in verse 34:9, he goes through and he goes up, brings the 2 tables of stone. And then Moshe bows his head and worships, and he makes a plea. He asks him to pardon the lawlessness, because now if YHWH is going to dwell among his people, he knows that that's going to be a bad thing if they are lawless and if they are wicked. So we see this concept here in verse 9. It says, "And he said, if now I have found favor in your sight, O YHWH, let my Adonai, I pray you, go among us, for it is a stiff-necked people, and pardon our lawlessness and our sin, and take us for your inheritance." You see, the fact is, even though he wanted YHWH to dwell among them, he knows that if he dwells among them, and he comes among that camp and there's wickedness, then that judgment is going to come. This is this concept of no man will see my face. In the scriptures, in the Ramez, the spiritual definitions, the model of the face is also the same as judgment. So nobody will see his judgment and live. So if he comes among the people and he looks upon what they're doing is wickedness, judgment will come to those people. And so this concept of saying, you want to draw near to God, or you want God to come among you, and people don't realize that if that was to happen, our wickedness would be revealed, and that wickedness would bring us great punishment. And that would not be a good thing. I mean, here you have Moshe, who it says was the humblest man on all the earth, hand chosen by God. You have Aharon, his brother. They couldn't just go to God anytime they wanted. This idea is just foolishness. So next we go into the next part of the Parashat, where he talks about those nations who were cast out, and he says basically, don't do any of those things like the people who I cast out from before you. So this concept goes again into restraint and the responsibility of trying to draw near to God. It comes with responsibility. And if you draw near to God and you're unprepared, this will be a bad thing. Next we talk about the first fruits. And this first fruits of giving to YHWH the first fruits, this is a great example of 2 things. Number 1, being set apart for YHWH. The first fruit is set apart, then it's offered. There's a process of which it has to be presented and offered. It isn't just anything goes. And it's also a model of restraint, because the first fruit is the first ripe. The first thing that comes up. Most people say, wow, finally, here's some of the first fruits of my labor. I'm just going to grab that and I'm going to enjoy it because it's the first chance I get. And what we see with the first fruits is we have to have restraint. We have to pause. Even though we could take that first fruit, what we do instead is set it apart for YHWH. We restrain ourselves and have self-discipline of what looks like could be the best of the crop, and we set it apart. And then we go through an entire process in order to offer up that up to God. And after that, we can have what we want. But we see this process where there's always a gap between what we want and our desire, and waiting and going through the process in order to achieve that. And we see the same thing with the Torah. Many people, I believe, are confused in this concept that they've chose to believe in God, and all of a sudden they think that's the end of the game. They planted a seed in the ground, and now they tell themselves, I'm full and I've had a huge harvest. It just doesn't. The natural world doesn't work that way. God's processes don't work that way. We see that there's always a process and time and self-restraint and work that go involved in order to reap that latter harvest. And we see the same concept in the first fruits and with the Torah. You believe, you decide you're going to obey God. That's great. That is the great first step. Then comes a lot of work. Then comes in learning what God wants, going through the process that God's lined out and doing it as He said, and then waiting and being patient for those times and those events to come, and being very cautious about how we approach God, especially when we're still learning to be, go through the process of being prepared. If you're unprepared, you haven't finished doing all the things that you're supposed to do, then, it's like turning in a test before you've answered all of your questions. It's just foolishness. We end up at the end with the dry bones story. And this again shows us this process. Here were these bones. They laid in the ground, in the graves for a long period of time. These bones that it says represent Israel, they have been set apart. This is Israel. The fact that they sat in the grave for a long time and that they're going to be raised to new life, YHWH already knows this. So it's just as important in the first part, when they're in the grave, when you can't see the promises, as it is when they're risen up. And then they're brought together. All the pieces are brought together just like the body. It's an incredible process how our body is put together. All the connecting pieces. It talks about these dry bones and the sinews, the muscles coming back on them. And then what happens after all this? They still weren't alive. He called the spirit, the breath, the wind, to come and breathe the spirit of life into them. You see, this is the final process. This whole long thing happened. It wasn't just enough to say, hey, we're the dry bones of Israel. So what? So you are. That's just a part of a big, long process. But all of this has to be connected. Everything has to come back together. All the parts have to be in place. And then, through that process, the Spirit comes, and then you're a whole being. And, this whole concept of being set apart for YHWH, it's to be set apart like those bones are set apart. But it's not finished just because they're in the grave. As a matter of fact, that's far from it. There's a much greater process that they're going to be taken through, but it has to come in the right time. And in order to be set apart for YHWH, don't get so impatient. It's like the birth process. Those dry bones are just like forming, a child in the womb. You have this bad theology out there of people saying basically, come Mashiach now. You have this concept of, wanting to have God dwell among them, even though they're not taking in consideration, as Moshe did, the lawlessness of the people that he would be coming among. And we have this concept of birth. Just because you were conceived in the womb is a process. Lungs are forming, limbs are forming, all these complex processes are coming together. Just because, you're conceived doesn't mean that you want to be born yet. And you have a lot of underdeveloped babies, children of God, basically saying, come Mashiach now, saying, deliver me now. And, if you deliver a baby that's premature, the risk is things haven't developed correctly, the lungs won't be strong enough, the immune system, all these different things aren't going to kick in, which means if that baby is born too soon, then the result they will come into the next world, but it'll be an instant death. And we can see that many people want into the kingdom. But I say again, if you're underdeveloped, if you are wicked and lawless and you come into that kingdom, even if you got in, you would be an example made of wickedness that would be then cast out for the people who actually were developed enough that belong in the kingdom. So I would definitely challenge people's beliefs that in wanting to be born prematurely. Work on developing yourself, study the Torah, learn the ways, go through the process, and be fully developed so that when the day comes that you can be born into the kingdom. And understand that being set apart for YHWH, it's a process. It starts small. You grow, you develop, so that ultimately at the end you can have all those blessings and all those things talked about. But we have to go through the process. I hope you've enjoyed this. I hope you're having a wonderful Passover, and pray that this will be a blessing to you. And until next Shabbat, I say shalom.